This is War Map, one step closer. Situation in the Lyman Direction. From the Lyman Direction, there have been increasingly more reports of Russian armed forces advancing near the eponymous city in recent weeks. The most fierce battles are occurring on the northeastern arc of its defense line. In particular, units of the 25th Army are gradually pushing the AFU out of the pocket near Stavki and from positions at Penkiv Yar. Control over the network of strongpoints in this sector is necessary to reach the northern outskirts of Lyman. In Lyman itself, assault units are fighting in the vicinity of the city hospital and at strongpoints on the Lyman-Zarekne highway. On the southern and southwestern outskirts of the city, Russian troops have reportedly managed to secure territory in the forestry enterprise, in the Lisovye neighborhood, and near the nursing home. The attacks here are aimed at bypassing AFU positions in the built-up area through a dense forest. Meanwhile, troops are establishing positions in Dibrova and fighting for control of strongpoints adjacent to Ozern. These are essentially the last serious obstacle before the village itself, located directly on the bank of the Seversky Donets. On the northern flank in the triangle of Sosnove, Sviatohirsk, Yarova, the situation is obscured by the fog of war. Small infantry groups are fighting in the territory of 3 settlements simultaneously, but the lack of footage and information prevents drawing an exact line of contact. Despite the overall positive dynamics in the direction, it's clearly not worth getting ahead of oneself. Statements by individual speakers that Lyman will fall in the next few days or weeks only harm the advancing units. The AFU still maintains the ability to supply the city's garrison and is creating new communication routes across the Seversky Donets. The highways approaching Lyman are still usable for AFU vehicles, even if controlled by drones. Under these conditions, the main goal is to prevent embellished reports, as practiced in the Kupiansk direction. Kill zone, near Pleshevka. As the units of the southern front of the armed forces of Russia gradually encircle Konstantinovka from the flanks, the assault troops are increasingly penetrating into the city's built-up area in the central sector. According to objective control footage, the advanced assault groups have reached the territory of Shanghai districts and Mountain. It is too early to talk about their consolidation on the new lines due to the impossibility of assessing the number of the breakthrough infantry. The AFU's defense of the city is mainly carried out with the help of drones and other long-range weapons. On the footage from Turn to War, it can be seen that the infantry is dispersed in small groups and holds only tactically important resistance nodes. This allows the Russian assault troops to infiltrate into the gaps between the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. The vicinity of Pleshevka also remains the scene of heavy battles. The Russian troops are not striving to take full control of the settlement, as this would expose the personnel to drone strikes from the higher northern bank of the Klebanbaik Reservoir. Therefore, a large part of the left bank of the Kryvyi Torets remains in the gray zone. The fields west of Pleshivka have been turned into a kind of kill zone by the Russian armed forces for the Ukrainian infantry trying to break into the village. Breaking the course of the battles in this sector will only be possible after the securing Berestka. This will allow the Russian armed forces to trap the Ukrainian formations on the north bank of the reservoir and cut off their supply of provisions and ammunition, fighting on the northern flank. The situation in the vicinity of Grishino and Dobropilia. On the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd direction, the most fierce battles are taking place in the vicinity of Grishino. Russian troops are trying to consolidate on the eastern outskirts of the village, while the armed forces of Ukraine are conducting raids with small groups of infantry towards Pokrovsk. Grishino is important for expanding the control of the Russian armed forces northwest of the agglomeration. From there, the armed forces of Ukraine tried to break into Pokrovsk in December, and there are also positions of UAV operators. Currently, guided 152mm shells Krasnopol are being used to hit targets in the village, among other things. At the junction of Rodinoe, Ivanovka, the current configuration of the front is hidden by the fog of war. And in Dobropilia, the AFU used robot carts with explosives to collapse buildings, justifying this by the presence of Russian infantry there. However, there are 8 kilometers from the city to the forward edge. So either there really were fighters of the Russian armed forces who infiltrated into the AFU's rear or remained there since the autumn breakthrough, or the armed forces of Ukraine are demolishing objects in preparation for the city's defense. The offensive towards Volkhya. The situation on the Burluk direction. In the Kharkiv border area, things are not calm again. On the morning of January 20th, from the Burluk direction, reports came in about the stormtroopers taking Degtyarnoy. In reality, however, the village, due to its geographical location, was taken under the control of the Russian armed forces back in July 2025. However, the intensification of hostilities in the area did indeed occur. Judging by the video from the AFU side, Russian units have recently entrenched themselves in the forest strips on the approaches to Nestorno and Kruglom. The situation in the villages themselves will remain shrouded in the fog of war for the time being. The AFU is transferring reserves to the area, including UAV units. However, it is quite likely that the element of surprise allowed the occupation of the settlements. This will allow the units of the Russian armed forces in the area to develop attacks towards Zemlyanki and reach Volchia, and is also necessary to cover the flanks from counterattacks by the Ukrainian armed forces during the future clearance of the right bank of the river. Until next update.
Ура!